women's physiology is so complicated, it could be multiple hours.
It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it.
Well, let's get into it. Before we even start, I know you get probably this question asked all the time, but what made you decide to choose the path you have chosen and pretty much do what you do right now?
So I sort of grew up fairly sedentary. It was the early 80s. I mean, I did sports as a kid, but played a lot of video games. But I got to high school and we had mandatory athletics. And I started one year, I rode bikes, I swam, I did martial arts, and I just kind of liked what was happening. You know, I'd been sort of a chubby little kid. That led me to go to UCLA to study exercise physiology. And I went through some different things, from wanting to be a coach to physical therapist. And then when I got involved in competitive sports, inline skating, which was very big at the time, I got very interested in the science of training. I'd read all the bodybuilding magazines for years, would annoy my professors at office hours. And they were like, look, this is all nonsense, all this. So, and they pointed me to the medical library. Wrote my first book. At the time, I liked hearing myself type. I liked writing, and people wanted to start paying me to write. So sure, started writing for websites and sort of fell into it, but sort of got into writing, and I like helping people. And it just kind of, and I lucked into it in the sense that I was on the internet when it started.
And what made you go to the nutrition part? Because I know you've written like the protein book, rapid fat loss, flexible dieting, and the women's book. So it actually, what made you write those books, especially the women's book? Like, what inspired you to write that one?
So I don't really know why I focused on nutrition. I think just because there's so much information on training, and I've thought about it, but fat loss is always not only a general interest, but it was always one of mine, right? Like, I'm sure there's sort of, that you want to fix yourself. So I've been sort of a chubby little kid. So I was always interested in fat loss, and psychologists are usually some of those crazy people you'll ever meet. And I just kind of turned it into a career. And I don't know, I started writing my first book, The Ketogenic Diet. Originally, I was going to do the exercise half, and I had a co-author, and he was going to do nutrition half. He was a registered dietitian, dietetics degree, and then he unfortunately couldn't finish his part, and I just had to go learn nutritional biochemistry, like from scratch. It was a long year, and just always had something new about fat loss to write about, and just sort of whatever topic. I think I was the first to really write about flexible dieting formally. That was 2004. And nobody was ready to listen, especially in the bodybuilding industry. What do you mean? What do you mean you don't have to eat clean and rigidly to get in shape? And then now, 15 years later, that's all anyone talks about. And so anyway, so that was just whatever was on my mind. I've never wanted to revisit the same topic. I need to write about women. And I realized, because I've been putting this topic off for about 10 years, because I knew that it was going to be complicated. So I started that, and I was posting stuff on Facebook, and every woman was like, oh my God, we need this information. And I realized that rather than just pumping out another fat loss book, because there's a million of those, it's like, this is where I should put my focus. And I thought originally, I'm like, oh, it should be no more than 3 or 4 chapters, right? Like, how complicated can women possibly be? Roughly 400 pages later, and realized this is volume 1. It got so out of control at one point, I had to split the books. Volume 2, if it ever gets written, will be about training, because it was getting up to the 500-600 page mark. And I'm like, it'll never get done, but who's going to buy that? So I had to split it out to just diet, nutrition, and fat loss. And it was still 400 pages, because that's how much, and I finally had to stop. Every time I would look into a new topic about women, there would be 5 more that I could follow up. And I could just keep going deeper and deeper and deeper. And finally, I was just like, I gotta be done at some point. The project nearly breaks me. They're exhausting. I'm obsessive. So I have to read everything. And when I get to the end of it, like, all I want to do is lay down for 2 or 3 years. But as hard as they are at the time, I learned so much from them. Like, my knowledge base expanded so much over that 2-year, 3-year span. I didn't understand the menstrual cycle. I didn't know what any of these words meant. So I had to start truly from the beginning to learn so that I could build upon
It must have been very difficult because, I don't know, back then, because you mentioned the internet was not as optimal as what it is now, and like finding information about women. How do you actually find information in the first place? Because it was so many topics, and it probably is like a little bit of nutrition here, a bit of medicine there, physiology. How do you do about it?
Well, for me, this is my most recent project. Like, I just basically read a lot of original research. When I was in college, though, I would we had something called Ovid, which is a very early. I would just have to go read physical papers and photocopy research, and I did that up until about 2002. I would go to the biomedical libraries, University of Texas, and just find a good paper. And then I would look at what all it had referenced, and I'd have to go get all those papers and then read them, and I have to get all those papers. And suddenly, now I just have 40 tabs open in my browser, but it's the same. I'll be halfway through a paper and they'll say, oh, here's something about women's body fat. Okay, I got to go read that now. And then that has 10 more papers I want to read, which is why it drives me a little bit crazy. Like my personality type is obsessive. And once I kind of get into it, I can't stop. And certainly there's more information about women online now than there was, but a lot of it, like so much information, just isn't very good, or it's not accurate. There's a lot of, you're a registered dietitian, there's a lot of noise in the weight loss industry and the fat loss industry. Oh, yeah. And usually the people that have the marketing budgets to get the top hit on Google don't have particularly good information. Like a lot of it, just popular diet books and things of that nature. So yeah, did I absolutely look for that? Sure, because I want to see what other people are doing or have come up with, or hopefully they found a paper that I didn't read, and now I have to go read that. But I think a lot of the problem, and I talk about this in the first parts of the book, is women weren't really involved in sports to a great degree, right? Till, especially in the United States, late 70s, early 80s, men had been competing for, not quite a century, 50, 60, 70 years. But at the time, most of the athletes were men. The coaches were absolutely all men. And most of the research, as it is now, was done on men. And this is an unfortunate part of all medical research. Something like 80% of research is done on men and only 20% on women. And that's true in every domain except weight loss, where women are vastly overrepresented. And the problem is that the assumption for years was, oh, well, women are just smaller versions of men. And we know now, again, in physiology, training, fat loss, diet, medicine, you can't do that. Like looking at it medically, women get different diseases at different times of their life in different proportions. They frequently express themselves differently. The symptoms women get are not the same as men's. And many things are missed in that regards because doctors are still just, okay, men are the default. Women are going to come in, and if we don't see the exact same symptoms, we don't know it. So a lot of things, and add to that, there's a history of women being dismissed as like, oh, you're depressed, you're tired. Well, we don't see anything. It's all in your head. There's still a lot of that going on, unfortunately. So it's just now, we're just now starting to see a real increase in research on women, especially in that domain. And just because this is funny, a buddy of mine who is in the industry, he said, why don't I see a lot of women researchers? Why don't I see a lot of women's names in research? And I said, because you're not reading research on women. And he's like, oh my God, am I sexist? They go, yeah, you're part of the problem. I go, well, what you're seeing is that women are there's so many more female researchers, and they're doing research on women's issues like the female athlete triad, which is now called relative energy deficiency syndrome, looking at menstrual cycle dysfunction, things that men just didn't care to research. All the same principles apply. As far as for fat loss, you have to create a deficit. Like the same general principles will always apply. However, there are considerations for women that men will never face in terms of menstrual cycle, changes in appetite. I know we're going to talk about some of this, energy levels, the
cravings, mood.
Yes, things that just, and as far as coaching, many women will see huge variations in their performance, energy, mood levels. If I'm training a male athlete, I'm getting the same guy in the gym every day, right? Whereas if I'm training a female athlete, I may be seeing week to week to week. I may be essentially coaching a different person. And another thing I don't want anybody to mishear is I will frequently make comparisons while we talk. Part of the reason I think this area, there's a little bit of baggage around it, especially in America, is for a long time, what are just differences? Biological differences were used to say that women were inferior, deficient, right? Men were sort of the default, like, oh, well, if men can do this and women can't, women are no, they're just differences. Women are physiologically, biologically better at, I'd say better, they have a greater response than men do, and vice versa. It's not a matter of better or worse, it's a matter of different. So whenever I make a certain statement, just that's all. There's no implication beyond that for me. But yeah, so if I have a female athlete and during 1 week of her cycle, her mood is down, her strength are down, his coordination is down. If I'm a good coach, and I wasn't always, when I was younger, I didn't know this stuff either. I need to take that into account. Do I have to adjust for training? A therapist I know has said, with men, I always know who I'm treating. With women, I don't know until about 5 or 10 minutes in. My nurse practitioner said, for some women, we have to give an antidepressant 1 week out of the month because that's the reality. Like they have to just take this into consideration. And so all these factors do play a role.
Yeah, I agree. So let's start with something very, very interesting and important is to define in simple terms what menstrual cycle is and what are the roles of like estrogen and progesterone when it comes to strength, performance, hunger, and cravings. So
yeah. So the way I look at it is the menstrual cycle is sort of the base of women's physiology, right? Because that's at puberty. If you look at little boys and little girls, basically the same for all practical purposes. Puberty is when you see the divergence. Men get testosterone, muscle mass, lose body fat, women start their menstrual cycle. And so that's kind of the base physiology. And then there's other things that we'll talk about, polycystic ovary syndrome, birth control, menopause that change the system for women. And these are also things men don't go through. Men are just the same from puberty till death, really. Women have completely different physiologies at different points in their life, in their lifespan, that are very important. Okay, so the menstrual cycle. A standard menstrual cycle runs between 24 and 32 days, right? We tend to think of it as being 28 days, but it's very rare actually for it to be exactly 28 days. Now, I will treat it as 28 just for simplicity, but it can vary. And
one question in one person, in the same person, do you find very common to say that the same menstrual cycle might change in timing with month to month? So one month is 28, another month is 32.
It seems to depend on the women or the woman. Some women, it's like clockwork. Like they can absolutely, once they have a certain day, it's the same every month. But others, there is variability where it may be relatively longer, relatively shorter. And one point I really want to make is that I can speak in generalities. I can speak in sort of an idealized, but every woman listening to this, or if you're a coach of women, you will have to kind of be your own scientist, right? You will have to track this over a number of cycles. And there's plenty of apps now. And I'll talk about a little bit about how to do this in terms of your mood, your energy, your sleep, your appetite, your cravings, so that you get the important data for you. Because ultimately, that's kind of what's important here, rather than, okay, so like I said, I will treat it as a 28-day cycle. Day one is the first day of menstruation. Just by convention, that is the first day of bleeding. That is day one. Generally divide this cycle in half. Okay, so day 14 is ovulation. And then, so you have 2 weeks before ovulation, 2 weeks after ovulation. So the first 2 weeks are called the follicular phase. This is when the follicle, which contains the egg, is developing under influence of a bunch of hormones. So if here's menstruation and here's ovulation, estrogen starts very low. It'll kind of come up. It'll peak about 3 days before ovulation. It'll crash back down. And progesterone stays extremely low. So essentially, estrogen is not only the dominant hormone, but really the only hormone that's important. So right before ovulation, with this big hormonal peak, the follicle explodes, releasing the egg. That's ovulation. I would also mention that about 3 days before and after ovulation, testosterone spikes a little bit from fairly low level. I suspect that's to increase sex drive. That would just be, and what we should realize is that we're going to talk about this in terms of diet, nutrition, fat loss. The whole goal of the menstrual cycle is really geared towards pregnancy.
Yeah.
Right. So all the physiology I'm going to talk about, that's what your body wants to do. What you want to do may be something very different. All right. So ovulation occurs. The follicle now will form something called the corpus luteum. The second half of the cycle is called the luteal phase for that reason. So follicular phase, follicle, luteal phase, corpus luteum. Corpus luteum will start to produce estrogen and progesterone. So at ovulation, both estrogen and progesterone are low. Progesterone will sweep up to a peak about halfway through. We're coming back down. Estrogen, same pattern. but it'll only reach about half the level as it did in the first 2 weeks, right? So if we've got the full cycle with ovulation, estrogen goes up, crashes, then comes back up. Progesterone comes up, and then back down. So we've got follicular phase, luteal phase, and the second week of the luteal phase, the 4th week of the cycle. Typically, if women are going to experience premenstrual syndrome or premenstrual tension, as it's called some places, it'll typically be in that week. Now, even there, women show so much variability. Like I found some women might experience some experience none at all, right? Some women experience no PMS symptoms whatsoever. And in my experience, they often don't understand what the big deal is, any more than men can understand it. If you could give every man in the world a menstrual cycle for 2 or 3 months and have them experience, it would reduce so much tension between women and men that occurs every month. If men could truly understand what's going on, rather than the "can you stop being crazy" approach to it, like it is some women will have a couple of days earlier in the luteal phase and it'll go away and it'll come back. Like, again, every woman tends to be a little bit different. Some women will have some symptoms, and these premenstrual syndrome symptoms can be cramping, mood swings, loss of coordination. Some women I've known report losing their words, like their vocabulary, their brain doesn't work as well. And that's because of low estrogen. Estrogen is very involved in neurological function. So mood swings, water retention, which I'll talk about a little bit. And there's just a host of others. Now, some women get hit so hard, they get what's called premenstrual dysphoric disorder, PMDD. They may be literally incapacitated physically due to muscular cramps, due to pain, depression. If they're prone to depression, they may get that. Some women will be suicidal during that week. And it's not a large percentage. Like I think something like 30% of women experience PMS, most of whom will experience, and only 5 to 10% may experience the premenstrual dysphoric disorder. But that's to say that only 5 to 10% is sort of a dismissal, because the 5 to 10% that are going through it may literally not be able to get out of bed for a week. And it is not an excuse or there is a biology to this. And I'll be honest that I never really looked deeply into why some women have worse cycles than another. It's got to do with relative hormone levels, how their body's responding to estrogen and progesterone. But more important than the why is just that you may experience this.
I hope you enjoyed this episode, and make sure you subscribe to my channel and hit the bell button so I can provide you with more information every time I upload a video. So stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you so much.
And do you think that probably it's also association with not just estrogen, progesterone, but it is affecting other hormones, like perhaps your leptin, thyroid hormones, your serotonin, all of these things that might affect?
Yes, and it's interesting that you mentioned serotonin and also dopamine, two of the big brain chemicals. Those are impacted by estrogen and progesterone. And as those hormones are falling, both of them tend to fall. So when serotonin falls, if you're prone to depression or mood swings or what have you, they tend to get worse. As dopamine falls, you may have food cravings. There's even some research that I can't say I've looked into that women who are trying to quit smoking or quit alcohol or quit recreational drugs, when they start during the menstrual cycle, has a very significant impact on their success rates. And I'll talk about why that is in just a second. So that's the overall cycle. 28 days, ovulation in the first half, follicular phase, estrogen, second phase, progesterone and estrogen both go up. Then let me talk about their effects. Estrogen gets a lot of the blame for women's issues, And I do want to make the point, even though I'm going to say that each one has like good or bad effects, realize that they're both critical for women's health, right? They are bad in the sense of that if you're trying to lose fat, change body composition, they can have negative effects in that regard, right? No hormone in the body is good or bad. So estrogen's effects are primarily positive. It helps to control appetite, which is actually the most controlled right before ovulation. Anti-inflammatory effects, helps with skeletal muscle, like remodeling after training, with it rebuilding itself after you train. Actually enhances fat burning within skeletal muscle. Improves insulin sensitivity, so women's bodies handle carbohydrates better. So most of estrogen's role is really positive in that sense. And there is actually research that, or at least a suggestion, if women are going to start a diet, they should do it in the first half of the cycle when their appetite is most controlled. Because that way they can at least get 2 weeks of success where they're not running into the problems that occur in the second half of the cycle. So in the second half of the cycle, as progesterone has its own effects that tend to be the opposite of estrogen's effects. tends to cause insulin resistance. So women's blood sugar may get a little bit unstable, which can impact appetite and mood. Tends to directly promote fat storage in the hips and thighs. Causes a little bit of muscle protein breakdown. It's not enormous, but again, it's very much the opposite of estrogen's effects. It's not inflammatory, but it's not anti-inflammatory. And on top of all of progesterone's direct effects, it blocks estrogen's positive effects. So it's kind of a double whammy. Couple of the things that I actually probably should have mentioned that occur in that second half of the cycle. Body temperature typically goes up a little bit. It's something like, and I think in Fahrenheit, sorry, it's like 0.5 degree Celsius, I want to say. It's something in that 0.3 to 0.5, it's somewhere in that range. And, they used to use basal body temperature to try to plan pregnancy. Like it's not particularly accurate, but it's at least sort of tells you that ovulation has occurred. Along with that, you typically see, and you just see an increase in energy expenditure, about 100 to 300 calories per day. But you also see an increase in cravings and appetite. And it's hard to say. Part of the trouble studying women's physiology is you've got two hormones that are changing, overlapping, interacting. Like, how do you separate these out? So with the appetite issue, is it because estrogen is falling? Is it because progesterone is going up? Is it the ratio of progesterone to estrogen? It's really, 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 like men have one hormone, testosterone. It's super easy to study them. And that's not a good reason not to study women, but that is part of the reason. I knew an exercise scientist that was trying to do a research study that included women, and they're supposed to come in and do whatever exercise test. And one of the subjects started her period a day early. And he said, okay, see you in a month. We can't measure you because we needed to measure it during the last week of the cycle. So it's also difficult to determine what part of the cycle women are in. Day counting doesn't work very well. So ideally you do blood tests. You can use ultrasound. You can do an ovulation test. This costs a lot of money. So research frequently is just like, we're not going to bother with, or they do it and don't take menstrual cycle into account, which makes the data meaningless. Because frequently you will see huge differences between follicular phase and the luteal phase, or between one or the other versus men. So like the follicular phase in men might be the same, but the luteal phase and the follicular might be different. The luteal, it gets, like I said, it's complicated, and this is why it's not studied as much as it should. So during that second half, energy expenditure is up, but typically so are cravings. And so is appetite. And that's due to progesterone, well, probably. So, and women will eat, if they're not consciously aware of it, 300 to 500 calories extra compared to that 100 to 300 calorie boost. So it's very easy to out eat it. Now, if you think about this in pregnancy terms, it makes total sense, right? Produce the egg, maybe make women want a little bit more sex right around ovulation. The corpus luteum is helping to make sure that the lining is there in case. So if a woman gets pregnant, then her body wants to put calories and store them in hip and thigh because that supports pregnancy and breastfeeding. And if a woman doesn't get pregnant, that's why everything drops back. What menstruation and what cramping is the muscles breaking up that endometrial tissue that is then lost during menstruation. Now you might ask, why don't women just keep that? And there are sort of two reasons. I think one is you increase the risk of endometrial cancer, right? That's when you get an endometriosis. But also it uses up a lot of calories, right? 300 calories a day to maintain that. Women's bodies are phenomenal at sparing calories. We'll talk about that too. So for a woman's body to just maintain the endometrial lining for 4 weeks is a waste of energy that she might need later on when she gets pregnant. So women go through this whole cycle, month to month to month, in preparation to get pregnant. Didn't happen. Well, we'll reset it and start over again. And that can be from the time she's 12 to 15 to menopause, which can be anywhere between 40 and 50, sometimes a little bit earlier, sometimes a little bit later. So women are going to have this for 30 some odd years, whereas men are just the same. We're just the same jerks for those 30 years. Anyway, so that's the basis of the menstrual cycle.
Let me ask you something before you go on. Why is there what do you think there might be higher risk of binge eating around ovulation and late luteal phase?
I think it's probably related to that change in estrogen, progesterone. Dopamine levels are getting sort of dysregulated, which tends to promote cravings in that regard. You've just basically got this whole neurochemistry where serotonin's dropping, dopamine's dropping, and women that are prone to that. Now, there is also a really interesting cultural aspect of this that I think is worth mentioning. Two things. One is that some research has shown that women who are brought up in cultures that have a really negative attitude towards the menstrual cycle and realized that we did traditionally for hundreds of years, women were dirty or unclean, or you just didn't talk about it. And it's changing, but there are still cultures, whether it's religious or whatever, have worse symptoms because there is a psychological aspect of this. They've basically been sort of told or taught, oh no, this is something bad, that it happens, and things of that nature. But there's a really interesting cultural aspect of cravings. In the US, women tend to crave one of two things, either sweet foods or savory foods, like meat, believe it or not. It's one of the two. In America, chocolate is almost like universally craved. But that seems to be cultural, because I know I've got a study somewhere that in Spain, the most craved food is chicken. Because presumably, and again, this, for whatever reason, because what happens is, okay, you have a teenage girl having premenstrual symptoms, and her mom, what does your mom tell you? Here, eat this, it'll make you feel better. And it becomes this kind of, but I found that very interesting, that I just always tended to think it was chocolate. It's like, no, it's kind of culturally whatever you were taught to do, but it's just changing neurochemistry. I said blood sugar can become very unregulated. So women may be having blood sugar crashes, which tends to promote appetite and cause mood to swing down and things of that nature. So it's just that, in a very real sense, that second half of the cycle kind of wants to make women eat more to store in their hips and thighs to be ready just in case. And do
you think that is associated with that insulin, the slight insulin resistance we see in the second phase of the menstrual cycle?
Probably, since that's going to be changing where calories are going. There's just some weird, women's hormones do some odd, not odd things, but in terms of how they're impacting our physiology, it's all kind of, and years ago, like during breastfeeding, and I'll come back to your question, women's bodies actually use hip and thigh fats preferentially, prefers to use that to break that. And I'm sure, I don't know if you've worked with pregnant women, but you've probably known them that their hip and thigh fat just disappears when they're breastfeeding. Like there's this weird hormonal like switch that occurs. Like normally women want to store fat down there, and all that's related to what's going on in the second half of the cycle. And for years I was like, how can I mimic what's going on during breastfeeding? What can I do to sort of trick women's body? And I gave up on it. I could never figure it out. Maybe I should revisit that. But yeah, so you've got insulin resistance, blood sugar becomes is not regulated as well. That can promote appetite. Insulin resistance can change where calories kind of get stored. Progesterone is activating something in women's hip and thigh fat that is specifically for storing fat in that area. So if there's excess calories around, which appetite and hunger are trying to make you want to eat, it's just kind of a double or triple or quadruple whammy that women's bodies just, and don't mishear me. I'm not saying that this is, obviously women can control this to one degree or another, right? This is what your body is trying to do if you pay no attention to it. It simply may be more difficult during those 2 weeks. That's why I said, there's a logic to starting a diet in the first 2 weeks to just get a little bit of momentum. Because starting a diet in the second half of the cycle, when you're craving sweets or chicken or whatever you're craving, and your hunger's off the charts, and you're about to have a week where your mood may be terrible, which can lead to stress eating, and like not the best time to try to make major changes to your eating or activity patterns. Ideally, save it for the first half of the cycle.
When we think about the cortisol and water retention and increased hunger, how can you talk a little bit about why is that water retention happening in certain parts of the menstrual cycle as well? And the cortisol, we see that we tend to be a little bit more sensitive to stress in the second phase of the menstrual cycle as opposed to in the first phase of the menstrual cycle.
So yeah, I should have mentioned the water retention. So typically, the two big times for women to retain water is right before ovulation and definitely in the final week of the cycle. And what seems to be going on is estrogen and progesterone also impact how women's bodies store sodium. Water progesterone actually causes water loss. That is, I guess, one benefit of it is because it blocks the cortisol receptor. It blocks one of the receptors involved in water retention. It actually blocks the receptor where testosterone binds. So women often find that if they're prone to oily skin or acne or what have you, typically clears up in the first week of the luteal phase, the first week after ovulation. Frequently that is the case. So what seems to be happening is that right before ovulation, that big estrogen peak and crash causes women's body to hold on to more sodium. So if they're on a high salt diet, it's typically when there will be some water retention. Then that'll go away in week 3. the week after ovulation. And then as everything, progesterone and estrogen crashes down, you see the same thing, but to a greater degree. You don't have progesterone causing water loss. There seems to be kind of this rebound effect. Cortisol may be involved, but what I've found, and with some women who followed the advice in my book, if they lower sodium and or increase potassium during those parts of the cycle, a lot of that water retention is eliminated. It really seems to be that women's bodies just store more sodium for some reason. And if you can keep your sodium lowered or just get that sodium potassium ratio, which I'm sure you've talked about on your show, that seems to help a lot.
Like, obviously we know that there is some water retention, but how much, like, I know this affects so much when we are tracking fat loss and the weighings. It can be just so much variation and fluctuations that can actually affect so much women. I don't know, their mood, and like they think all their progress is ruined because they gain weight.
Oh no, it's absolutely true. Like, it's very easy. So water retention can vary enormously, right? Some women get very little. It might be, half a kilo or a kilo right before ovulation. And some women can probably gain 2 or 3 kilos before, during the final week of the cycle. Now, it's very easy, especially for me, to go, oh, it's just water, don't worry about it. But that's not the world we live in, because right or wrong, it is very psychologically stressful to women, especially if they're dieting, right? Because they're doing everything right. They're following the plan, they're doing their training, and then suddenly from week 1 to week 2, their body weight is up by a kilo. How can you not get demoralized by this? And then into week 3, it drops, so you hooray. And then in week 4, it's up 2 kilos. And you're just like, I'm doing everything right. My dietitian is clearly an idiot. And it is really problematic. And what that means practically is that women can't track week to week. This is another consideration. Men can track week to week. I mean, can men get water retention? Sure, but is it biologically programmed, for lack of a better word? Or is it going to run on a week-to-week cycle? No. So there's 2 ways to approach it. One, again, women, be your own scientist. Track this, right? Use Happy Scale or one of those apps. Weigh yourself daily, as long as it doesn't make you crazy. I mean, psychologically stressed. I don't mean crazy in a negative way. But for many people, it does drive them. It can really mess with your head. And see what your patterns are. And if you see that, okay, usually your lowest body weight will be in the first week of the cycle, maybe a few days after menstruation. So if you see that, okay, from week 1 to week 2, your weight's up a kilo. Well, that's water. It has to be. And then maybe it drops half a kilo in week 3, and then it goes up. I might even say just stay off the scale in week 4. It's nothing good can come of it. Truly, nothing good can come of it. But if you now know that that's your pattern and you're dieting, well, you can sort of track, because, like, let's say you're 70 kilos and then you're 71 in week 2 and you're whatever. Well, so you're 69 kilos, you go up to 71, back to 70, and then up to 73 or whatever it is. Well, if you're dieting and your first week weight is at 68, well, if you go back up to 70, you get that 2 kilo increase. Well, that's the water that you've already determined. But what I would generally recommend is what women have to do is compare the same week of the cycle to the same week of the previous cycle. So you can't compare week 1 to week 4. Week 1 to week, well, you can, but you shouldn't. More accurately, compare week 1 of this month to week 1 of the last month. And so let's say you started at, easy numbers, 70, 72, 71, 74, just to throw numbers. And I'm not saying that will be or won't be. Next month, 70 drops to 69. You've lost a kilo. But the previous month it was 72. I would expect that to be 71. Now, is it higher? Yes, but it's the same 1 kilo loss. The 71 should ideally come down to 70, right? It's still higher, but it's the same kilo loss. You know what? Week 4, there's no way to know. It's probably best to just, like I said, just stay off scale. Nothing, it's not worth it. But this also adds another issue that, it can make it so you may not know for a month if what you're doing is truly working, right? With a male dieter, I'll know in a couple weeks if he's losing. And for women, and that can slow things down if women are on a time schedule. Like, it's just another consideration that women have to address that men simply don't. But
I guess you could follow up with other techniques of measuring your body composition, sure. Because that's what you're actually looking for, is to change your body composition. So what would you say could be a very simple way to sort of not just monitor your weight. Okay, it is something that is very practical and easy, but sometimes it is not enough to get the whole picture of your progress. Like measurements, like waist circumference, hip circumference, skin folds.
Yes, I think circumferences are extremely easy. I don't think they get affected enormously by water weight. Like, because if a woman gains a kilo across her entire body, it's not enough. And honestly, I mean, women usually it's going to kind of move just by gravity, right? Ankles, calves, that's typically where you sort of see the issue. And I know some women just feel generally kind of, I guess, puffy, for lack of a better word. Yeah, tape measurements would be one. Clothing is always, and very easy. Just have a standard piece of clothing. Pictures can work, but we are our own worst enemy when it comes. What we see in the mirror and what everybody else sees is very different. Like I am a big believer in taking progress photos over whatever 6 to 8 weeks. But when we get in front of it, and mirrors differ. Like something I've joked at, like every gym has what I call the magic mirror, the one that's just makes you look, and because that's the one the guys are always in front of, because it makes them look bigger and leaner than they actually are. Just the way the lighting is, or the whatever is causing that. And if you don't have, or if you have bad lighting in your bathroom, certain lights just make us look terrible, like very artificial, types of lighting just tend to not. So that can backfire. But yeah, I think certainly tape measure circumferences and measure multiple sites, right? It's very possible that, one area, because women hold water there for whatever reason, is a little bit higher. But then if you measure everything else and it's lower, it's just, okay, that. And women, we can talk to her blue in the face and go, look, it's water. And that's real easy to say. I know high-level athletes that are physique competitors. They know the difference between body fat percentage and body weight. They know that this is water, it still stresses them out. Even when you know better, it still stresses you out. I mean, it can stress men out too, because they're holding water. If they jump on the scale every once in a while, they're like, oh my God, dieting and the 2 pounds up. But women more so than men have been very programmed that the scale is what matters. I knew I had a female trainer years ago, and she was very tall. And she probably weighed, I want to say 80 kilos. I mean, she was over, I think in feet. She was tall. And she decided she wanted to weigh 60 kilos. And I said, A, we have to cut off one of your legs. But B, where did that number come from? Right? Where is this arbitrary number coming from? And I never did get an answer. But that in her head, that was a proper women's weight. And we've got decades of women being told this, very much so. And it's one thing to just say over and over and over again, don't worry about it. But it's dismissing a very real issue that you do have to take into account. So yeah, I think the scale is great as a rough tool, but it can be misleading, more so for women than for men. And as much as I'm a believer in regular weighing, if you're one of those people that live and die by your scale weight, if daily changes and daily fluctuations, which are very normal, are going to sort of make you nuts, then the scale is not a good tool for you. Yeah. And you will need to find, because a tape measure won't be nearly, it's not like a tape measurement is going to go up 2 centimeters day to day to day. Whereas scale weight can easily shift, 1 to 3 kilos based on what you ate. Did you go to the bathroom? I don't want to get gross about it, but all those factors play into scale weight. Other measurements, even skin folds. Your skin fold is not going to go from 10 millimeters to 15 day to day to day because you had a high salt meal, whereas your body weight may very well jump by that much. So those are probably going to be roughly better measurements to keep track of.
Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate you so much. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below. And I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.